Now that we have the book and author information in Cassandra, it's time to build a web application that surfaces that as a web page on an API access or URL access rather. I want to be able to access a URL and get a page corresponding to the book, in keeping with the philosophy of the Open Library API. It's like one page per book in the world. So we don't have all the books in the world yet. We just have 50, but it's going to scale. What I want to do is provide a URL and a Spring Boot Spring MVC app, which is going to take that ID from the URL, the book ID from the URL, get that book information from Cassandra, and display it in a web page on the browser when the user accesses it, right? It's not going to be a REST API. It's going to be an HTML response. I'm going to use Spring MVC and Thymeleaf to render that HTML response. So in order to start a Spring Boot API, well, the typical, common way to get a Spring Boot API and a Spring Boot project rather is to go to start.spring.io. But there is one couple of things that we need to do here. One thing that we really need from our application is authentication, right? We want people to be able to sign in and register if they haven't signed in, for example, and then we want to track people's reading habits. So we need to know who the logged in user is, right? It's not an anonymous application. We want people to log in and mark a book as read, right? Mark, the number of stars they would give for a book and so on. So we need to know who the user is, which means setting up Spring Security. And if you're doing the user ID password authentication mechanism, you need to set up like a login form, a sign up form where people can register and sign up, a confirmation form, like somebody enters an email ID and a password, you send them an email, have them click that link to confirm, right? A password reset form, because people might forget their passwords, password reset procedure, account expiry procedure. There's a whole lot of work there. And I don't want to do this for this course because this is mainly building this data related application, like a Cassandra database application, which scales. So I don't want to deal with Spring Security and all that stuff. So in a way, I'm going to be, if you watch those cooking shows where they say, okay, here's this really complicated thing that they're cooking, and then they bring this thing out of the oven, and then they say, this is something that I prepared earlier. I'm just going to take this and add this to the final product. Feels like cheating. But in this case, I'm going to bring something into this cooking show, which is kind of pre-made, but not fully. And you will understand why I'm doing this. What I'm going to bring is this project called the Spring GitHub Login Starter, right? So this is a Spring Boot project, which has GitHub login via OAuth baked into it. It's a very, very simple project, okay? I'm going to link this in the video. What this does is basically provides a URL where you click on it, you can authenticate via GitHub. Okay, if you have a GitHub login, you can log in via GitHub, and then the application, the Spring Boot application that you have here, knows that this is you with this particular GitHub login, right? Why GitHub? Just a random choice. We are all developers, so we probably have GitHub ID. This could very well have been a Google authentication or a Facebook authentication. It really doesn't matter. Some authentication so that we don't have to deal with like creating the login form, the sign up form, the password reset, all that stuff, right? So this is kind of makes it simple. And I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to show you what this is right now and what this looks like. And then you can use this as a starter for any of your other applications as well, right? So if you need some project with basic authentication, just pick this and run with it, right? I'm going to show you what this contains, and then we're going to build our Goodreads application on top of it. This has very minimal dependencies. We're going to need some dependencies added to it, like for example, the Spring Data Cassandra, some of the dependencies that we already used, right? We have used a bunch of dependencies over here in our pom.xml. We are going to kind of copy paste some of this stuff here, right? See, Spring Data Cassandra was a requirement because we need that Spring Data project to connect to Cassandra. All those things are going to be the same in this new project as well. But this is going to be the starting point. So here's what this is going to look. I'm going to just download this as a zip file. I don't want to clone this thing. I'm going to open this, and here is my project that I'm going to open in code. Okay, so I'm going to open my terminal, and then I'm going to say code, and then open this project. So I have a new Visual Studio Code window. I'm going to trust in the first screen that shows up, and here it is. New VS Code window with this project. Doesn't, again, like I said, it doesn't have a whole lot. It has 2 Java classes. First, let's look at the pom.xml. Okay, we have, this is the GitHub authentication template. Basically, it has a bunch of dependencies. It has the Spring Security starter, which you would expect it's needed because it's Spring Security after all, right? Next, we have the Thymeleaf dependency because I have like a simple page which shows, hey, click here to authenticate via GitHub. And then it just authenticates via GitHub. It's just there. You don't have to use it. You can have it be an API as well if you like. Next is the Spring Web dependency. So Spring Web application after all. So you get Spring MVC and all that stuff there. You have the Thymeleaf extras. This may or may not be necessary. I'm not sure about this. Try removing it and see. But it's basically Spring Security integration with Thymeleaf. If you want to do like user ID password forms, then I guess this is necessary. Oh, this is also necessary when you have form submission. Now I remember. When you have like an HTML form and you need to submit it, when you have a non-authenticated application, it's just a simple form, a simple post, works fine. But when you have Spring Security and you have a form which does a post, you need to make sure you have cross-site request token enabled in the form. Okay, so this allows you to do that. You get that cross-site request token automatically there, and you can add, there are certain tags which allows you to customize it. So your application is secure for a bunch of hacking vulnerabilities that people will try and exploit if you have like a logged in application. Okay, so that's why this is good to have. We have a Spring Boot OAuth client and OAuth Jose, which are like this for the JWT part of it. So when you have OAuth authentication requirements like auth with Google or auth with Facebook, or in this case auth with GitHub, these are the 2 dependencies that you would need. So I have those, and DevTools and test. Nothing else of importance here. So here is the home project. This is the main Java class. All right. So I have a simple, Spring application.run. This is what you get kind of out of the box. We have one user API, right? It's a REST API, which takes in the authenticated principal. So this is accessible only when somebody is logged in. Okay. So it takes in the authenticated principal, and then it gives you what the name of the authenticated user is. The principal is the authenticated person, right? So it's going to give you the name of the user. So this is accessible when you're authenticated. Okay. And now we have the security adapter, which is controlling what is the authentication mechanism over here. So we have a bunch of authentication configuration over here. So there is a configure method with a bunch of authentication configuration. It's basically saying, hey, when somebody has access to the /URL, which is the root URL, or an error message URL, permit everybody. Okay. Apart from that, any other request needs to be authenticated. Okay. There is some exception handling here. There is some CSRF handling here. So like make sure that cross-site request forgery is protected. And then logout is when you're logging out, go back to the / and then permit all for that. And now with this configuration, how is the user getting authenticated? It is by the OAuth 2 login. All right. And how does this login work? Well, we're going to go to resources and application.yaml. Here are the configuration for login. So since we're logging in with GitHub, we need the client ID and the client secret for authentication. We are asking GitHub to authenticate for us, which means GitHub needs to know that there are authentication requests coming from our application to it. So we need to go to GitHub and say, I'm going to configure my application, and I'm going to say this is get the client ID and the client secret. So GitHub knows that this is a valid source of authentication that's coming from there. And with OAuth, it needs to kind of do this handshake between the user and saying, hey, the user, this application is trying to authenticate via me, and just want to make sure that you give the right permission, right? So it's the normal dance that happens with OAuth. If you're not very sure about this, if you're not familiar with OAuth, definitely check out my OAuth tutorial where I explain this in detail, kind of explain what are the three parties involved and what the communication is. But this is basically telling GitHub that this is going to be a request and then getting those tokens and adding it over here so that this application can make an OAuth call to GitHub. So this is the bare minimum OAuth sign-in application that you need to have to authenticate with GitHub. With Facebook, it's going to be similar, like just like you have GitHub over here for Facebook, it's going to be the Facebook's client ID secret. For Google, it's going to be Google's own thing. I'm going to demonstrate with GitHub. Right now, if I run this, it's not going to work because it doesn't need the client ID and it doesn't have the client ID and client secret. Let's set that up and that should be it. This is going to run as is. Okay, so how do you tell GitHub to create a new application? Well, you can do that by going over here to this drop down and then choosing settings. And here you will find all of the developer settings that you have over here, right? So there's a bunch of stuff over here, developer settings. So here are all the applications that you have, all the GitHub applications that you have. You can see here I have a better reads application already because I was trying something out. This is what I'm going to be using for the recording, but I want to show you how you can create a new GitHub app yourself, right? So you click on this new GitHub app and then give the app a name. I'm going to call this Better Reads Test. The homepage can be anything you want. This is basically when you have the OAuth message box that the user sees. They want to know what is the app that's requesting this access, right? So that's the reason why you have this. Now, as far as the callback URL is concerned, I actually have that in the instructions. So you see here in the readme.md, I have the callback URL specified. So this is the URL that GitHub is going to call back when the OAuth handshake is happening. So this is going to be available on your local, like when you run your Spring MVC, Spring Boot application, this URL is going to be enabled. This URL will accept requests. So basically this is GitHub saying, hey, browser, go call this thing now, right? So your browser is going to call this. This is, of course, something that works only on your machine, but that's fine for development. This is what we're going to be using. The other thing that I would recommend you do is uncheck the active box because we don't want to do a webhook URL. Remember, if this is active, you notice this becomes mandatory. You have to specify the webhook URL, but we don't want to do that. So I'm going to uncheck it. Now, the last thing you need to do is set the permissions, right? What are the permissions that your web application needs? Well, if you scroll down here, I don't need any of this stuff, right? We're not doing anything on GitHub itself. What we want is the user information, right? So that we can trust that this is one single user. So I'm going to say here, email address. I'm going to say read-only email address. Just show me the email address so that I can map it to a user on my application. I'll set profile as read and write. I don't know if this is required. Probably not. If I just get the username with the email address thing, then I don't even need that thing. I'm going to choose any account here and then say create GitHub app. We see registration is successful. And here is my client ID. Okay, so I can take this and paste this to the client ID in my application.yaml file, right? This part is going to be that client ID. The client secret is something that I need to generate over here. When I say generate new client secret, you see this? It generates a new one. And now I can copy this and paste this there. I'm going to delete this thing because I actually don't want to have this app here. I'm going to go to advanced and then delete this thing and delete Better Reads Test. I'm going to use the app that I already have, like I mentioned, which is this guy. It basically created the app using the same mechanism. So I'm going to first copy the client ID over here to this client ID. Again, the whole point of this is to tell GitHub that we are authenticating with this thing. Client secret. I'm going to generate a new client secret and then copy this thing and then paste this here. I am, of course, going to delete the client secret after I am done recording this tutorial so that, others don't use it, but you're going to have to do this yourself, right? You need to generate the new client secret. And whenever you refresh this page, this thing is gone. You won't be able to see this. You notice this thing is, you have the stars here. It doesn't show the entire client secret. That's intentional. You see this? That thing is gone. So you're going to have to copy and save it and assume that it's not going to be visible again, right? You have to delete and create a new one if that's gone. All right, so here we are in our Spring Boot application, and now I can actually run it like this. So let's test this and make sure this works, okay? So here is my, if I open the resources template index.html, this is basically the simple Thymeleaf template, right? It has this login with GitHub message, and then you have a ahref, which has this link, right? This is the link which starts the login process with GitHub. So let's see if this works. I'm going to click run and start this application. So the application is up and running. Now I'm going to go to localhost :8080, and I get this message, which is from that index.html. So I'm going to click here, login with GitHub. Now looks like it's logged in. This has happened before, I guess. So that's the reason why it's already logged in. If you're logging in for the first time, you would probably see like an authentication box. But now let's see. I'm going to access this API, which is the /user API, and it should print out, it should return the name. All right, so I'm going to do localhost 8080 /user, and see, it prints out the name. It returns the name of the person who has logged in via GitHub. So the way it's happening is, now when I clicked on that link, the authentication was established, and over here, when this user URL is accessed, which is what I'm doing over here, it is getting the principal. It's kind of declaring a dependency on the principal, saying, hey, Spring Boot, inject to this method call the principal object, which is the object that represents the currently logged in user. So I'm printing this out to the console, and I'm also returning this. Now you see the console should have the whole principal object printed. So here it is. It has all the granted authorities. It has my login, which is my username, the ID, a bunch of other stuff, links to other things. Well, everything is here. All I care about is the name. So that should do. Now with this in place, I have an application, a Spring Boot application, which does login with GitHub. So I can build my Better Reads app in this code base, and I know that authentication is there. So I can assume that when there is authenticated actions, like for example, marking a book as read, you have to be authenticated to mark a book as read. Otherwise, who is marking the book as read? We don't know, right? So right now, we just have the authentication part. When we add those features which are user specific, I can assume that the user is authenticated, kind of configure it so that the user is authenticated, and get the username from this thing. I can say principal.getAttribute of name. I'm going to get the name, and when that user marks, okay, I've read this book, I can say this user, principal.getAttribute of name has marked this book as read. I can save that. So when that user is logged in again and say, hey, what are the books I read? I can say, give me the books read by this user, principal.getAttribute of name, right? That's the way to tie a specific user to the actions that that user performs. This is how I plan to do it. So this had nothing to do with Cassandra. This was basically like a project which allows you to start working on secured, authenticated applications. So now we have like the framework here. I'm going to make a couple of quick changes. The first change I'm going to make is rename this to Better Reads app, because this is a Better Reads app after all. It's not a starter anymore. So it's basically renamed this thing here. And my index.html, I'm going to say Better Reads, and then maybe have a paragraph. Welcome to Better Reads app. Login to continue. And I'm just going to put this login link here. It's just going to be GitHub for this app. I'm not going to provide any other authentication mechanisms. Okay, so now we have these two things. I'm going to commit both the state of these applications. Okay, so the first one was this guy, better reads data loader. Well, there were a bunch of changes that we made that I didn't commit. I'm going to close this guy here. You don't need that. So here are some changes that we made to save book information. Okay, so upload book information on post construct. Commit that. So now we have that state ready. And now here I'm going to, I don't have initialized because I didn't clone this repository. I just downloaded the code. So there's not a Git repository. So I'm going to initialize the Git repository, which is basically saying Git init. And now I'm going to mark this as starter auth setup for better reads. So if you want to follow along, you can either get that repository that I shared, right? It's on my profile. It's literally called, where did that go? Spring GitHub login starter, or get this repository, which is my better reads, the first commit of my better reads app, and you can kind of work from there. Now with this ready, I'll see you in the next video where I'm going to build an endpoint which returns book information. See you there.